Francis Washington Girand had come a long way since the cold December day in 1852 when he left Kentucky. Now here he was, standing in front of the county clerk in Austin, county of Travis, state of Texas. The year, 1860. The date, March 14. Tomorrow would be the Ides of March for him. He would stand before an ordained minister of the gospel and promise to love, honor, and obey Anna Barton Crozier, age 23. He was 26 years old, and he had been in Texas 8 years. 8 years since he had worked his way on a wagon train from Christian County, Kentucky. He had worked his way because there was no money to buy a passage. Because he was 18 years old, and in those pre-Civil War days when you were 18 years old, you were a man. And because he just wanted to go to Texas. Things hadn't been too good in Kentucky. His father had died when he was just a year and a half old, and his mother had had a hard time holding the family together. There were 6 of them. He was next to the youngest, and most of the time the better pieces of chicken, when they had any, went to the eldest son, or the 2 older daughters. The baby always seemed to get most of the attention, which left him as a sort of an in-betweener. Land. When he made 18 and took off for Texas, they were sorry to see him go, of course, but his leaving wasn't any catastrophe. His father had been a Baltimorean who had moved to Kentucky in 1820 and who had prospered in everything except time and money. He couldn't remember his father. He only knew what he had been told. It is his father's dark eyes, and a love for reading, and a gift for conversation. It was his gift for conversation that had won him the hand and heart of Anna Barton Crozier. It certainly could not have been his money. He was only a clerk in the General Land Office. But the grinding poverty of his youth seemed far behind him on that March day in 1860, as he stood before the county clerk to apply for a marriage license. "These are the golden days," he said to himself. "Let me enjoy and always remember them." And so, with Anna Barton Crozier, he stood in Texas and was joined in the holy union of matrimony on the 15th day of March. Holy union of matrimony on the 15th day of March, 1860. The bishop dashed down the next day and returned the executed copy of the marriage license to the county clerk. He needn't have hurried. The law allowed him 60 days for the report. 1 year and 1 month later, Brigadier General Beauregard, commanding the provisional forces of the Confederate States of America, notified Major Anderson, commanding Fort Sumter, that he would open the fire of his batteries in 1 hour. It had been a short honeymoon, but it had been enough. Francis Washington Girand stuck 2 pistols in his belt, slipped his right index finger under the trigger guard of a Long John rifle, got his wife's younger brother Granville Crozier to do the same, and stood up to be photographed before marching off to join the famous Texas Brigade of the Army of Northern Virginia. the dawn of September 17th, 1862, at Antietam Creek, Maryland. The Confederates had just enough men on hand or coming up to make a fight of it. There never was another day like Antietam. That dawn-to-dusk fight above Antietam Creek finally went into the records as the most murderous single day of the entire war. Some of the Confederate units were mangled beyond repair. But Stonewall Jackson brought up reinforcements, the Texas Brigade, and the Federals were driven off in disorganized flight. His older brother, James, the one who got the better pieces of chicken, when there was any, had enlisted in the Confederate Army too, but his luck ran out in 1863, September. His younger brother, who labored under the unfortunate name of Fidelio, had followed him to Texas in 1857 and was running a plantation in Wharton County when the war between the states broke out. Fidelio went with the 8th Texas Cavalry, usually known as the Texas Rangers, and ended up back in Christian County, Kentucky, after the war. Francis Washington Girand finished up the war and went back to Austin, Texas, where he devoted the rest of his life to being clerk of the district court and raising a large family. There were 10 of them altogether, and 7 lived to become adults. Number 6 out of the 10 was born May the 20th in 1873 and was named James Bell Girand, after the, at that time famous, Judge James Bell, who possessed the dubious distinction of being the only man in Brazoria County who had voted against secession before the Civil War. James Bell Girand, Jim in this story, was born in an imposing 2-story house in Austin, Texas, that belonged to his mother's family, the Croziers. Not too much is known about his childhood days, except that he got his picture taken when he was 2.5 years old, that he got bit by a dog and never liked them for the rest of his life, and that he spent a good deal of time on a nearby farm. When it came time to go off to college, Jim headed for Texas Agricultural and Mechanical College to study agriculture. But on freshman registration day, he saw that there was a long and hot line of prospective students waiting to register in agriculture, and only a short line under a cool tree waiting to register in engineering. So Jim made a quick decision and got into the engineering line. This is the sort of thing that has led so many of the great philosophers to the writing of books. After engineering school, there was a succession of jobs that didn't amount to much. A draftsman for the Texas and Pacific Railroad, a county surveyor for Moore County out in West Texas, a route man for a logging road in northern Arizona, a surveyor for the Santa Fe Railroad in Williams, Arizona, and then finally, the big break came. In those days, around the turn of the century, government land surveys were contracted out to private surveyors, and any engineer who could qualify and make bond had a good chance of landing a contract. On June 13, 1900, Jim landed his contract, $5,000. It was a king's ransom in those days, and it gave Jim his start. The survey covered 10 townships on the south rim of the Grand Canyon, about 250,000 acres, but it didn't scare Jim a bit. He got his crews together, rented horses and wagons, started the men out before sunup, and in less than 6 months had the money he needed to head east to Tyler, Texas, and the girl he wanted to marry. She was quite a girl. Her name was Pamelia Goodman, and she would pile all of her hair on top of her head in the Gibson girl pompadour style of the era and go downtown and cut a swath a mile long and 40 rods wide without half even trying. And in that part of the South, few girls could do as well. She was from quite a family, too. Her grandfather, a couple of greats removed, was massacred in Lawrence County, South Carolina by the British during the Revolutionary War and got himself a monument to prove it. Not that it did him any good, because after he was massacred he never lived to enjoy his monument, but before he got into the fight he had married and left some children. Among them a good South Carolinian whose first name was Claiborne. And anybody born in South Carolina and named Claiborne is bound to be pretty handy with a jug. Claiborne begat Samuel, as the good book would say it, and Samuel spent his time during the Civil War doctoring the blue and the gray indiscriminately, with whatever brand of horse liniment happened to be handy at the time. After the Texans defrauded the Mexicans out of all that land north of the Rio Grande, he ended up with a chunk of it, which he left to his children, including Samuel Jr., who was Pamelia's father. It was quite a litter. Pamelia's older brother, Samuel III, ran away from home when he was 16 to join Lou Dockstadter's minstrel show, and when he got back home after some years on the road, he not only had the loudest checkerboard vest, but he had a diamond sparkler on his finger that looked as big as a locomotive headlight. And he could play a banjo, dance a buck and wing, and hold higher cards and drink more Tanglefoot whiskey than any man for miles around. Pamelia's younger brother was a bank clerk with a weak chest who went west to get his strength back but never did. Instead, he kept a tight hold on the first nickel that he had ever earned, and most of the others, and ended up enjoying poor health while owning half of the land in the state, including some oil leases. There were some more brothers and sisters of varying ages and dispositions, all of whom were in some kind of razzmatazz mostly. Pamelia was more genteel, and aided by a $600 bequest from her uncle's will, took the literary course at the Salem Female Academy in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. While she was there, she rejected one suitor, an impecunious tobacco farmer named Duke, who later on invented Duke's Mixture and Bull Durham, and ended up paying Trinity College $40 million to change its name to Duke University. Jim had met Pamelia at a dance in Terrell when he was a draftsman for the T&P and had been corresponding regularly. He'd had the chance to make a couple of trips back to Texas from Arizona, and when he was in Tyler he'd put his time to good use. Pamelia was naturally attracted to the curly-headed man with the dark eyes and a love for reading and a gift for conversation. It didn't take long. The reporter who covered the wedding perhaps got things mixed up. When he reported the groom came in leaning on the arm of his brother. And then the reporter went the whole way and had the bride leaning on the arm of her brother, Samuel number 3. Samuel number 3 being the way he was, it is more likely that he was doing most of whatever leaning on somebody's arm was being done about that time. In those days, the town of Williams, Arizona, had a population of 900 souls, including the lost souls who inhabited Johnny Jones' saloon on Railroad Avenue. They all turned out to welcome Jim and his bride home with a real Western chivalry, complete with war whoops and painted Indians. What Pamelia thought about this is not recorded, but it wasn't long before the newlyweds were firmly fixed as part of the social set of the town of Williams. When the local chapter of the Sons and Daughters of I Will Arise decided to take Shakespeare apart, Jim played Romeo to Pamelia's Juliet, aided by other local thespians and vigorously applauded by the rest of the town, including the lost souls, as Johnny Jones had honored the occasion by shutting up his grog shop. It was about this time that the Santa Fe Railroad decided they wanted to build a scenic railroad down to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and in looking around for an engineer to lay out a line for them, they picked Jim. He had been surveying all around that country and knew as much about the Grand Canyon as anyone. He found a remote side canyon where he thought he could get a railroad down and started out to explore it. Near the bottom he found a wilderness of almost unbelievable beauty, complete with blue-green waters, towering minarets, and a lost tribe of Indians. It didn't take him long to bring his helpmeet into the picture. There were no roads down into the canyon, but Pamelia was an accomplished horsewoman, and there was a Chinese cook to carry the baby in his arms. The baby, never called anything except Jimmy, stood up in his homemade crib in the tent and posed for his picture. If living in a tent at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, in the midst of a lost tribe of Indians, sounds a little primitive, just remember they were very much in love, and that this land of blue-green water, now called Havasupai, was a riot of color and waterfalls and cliffs and moonlight, where a man could do a man's work and a woman could fulfill her destiny. But the man's work was never done. The railroad to the bottom of the Grand Canyon was never built. Even in those days, There were bureaucrats in Washington who had nothing to do except think up reasons why something shouldn't be done. And the Santa Fe Railroad officials never could get a permit from the National Park Service to build the scenic railroad. Jim and Pamelia, with the Chinese cook carrying Jimmy, rode out of the canyon and back to civilization, this time to Prescott, Arizona. Now, Prescott was one of those towns that was built around the courthouse square. The block on the west side is still called Whiskey Row, from the number of saloons, Chinese restaurants, and second-story bordellos there. On the north side were the mercantile houses, the Bashford Burmester department store, Harry Shoemate's drugstore, and the ubiquitous cigar store. On the south side stood the imposing United States government post office, and the fire station, and the city jail. The east side was devoted to small and mostly unimportant specialty shops, including a ladies' ready-to-wear shop run by a man named Baron Goldwater, who was destined to have a grandson in the United States Senate. In front of the courthouse was a wading pool for children and a tremendous statue of a cowboy on a horse, Bucky O'Neill, one of Teddy Roosevelt's rough riders in the Spanish-American War, ex-sheriff, ex-desperado, ex-cowboy. It was a favorite gathering place for Prescotians of a Sunday afternoon to listen to the band concert and let the children play in the pond, and it wasn't long until Jim and Pamelia had another bundle of joy from heaven to help listen to the band concert and to join the other children in the pond. Sonny was born on May 14, 1906, the year of the San Francisco earthquake. Not that the two events were related. They weren't. It's just a convenient way to identify the year Sonny came into the world. Prescott was a long way from San Francisco, and Jim and Pamelia were so busy with 2 a.m. feedings that they didn't bother with the earthquake. They were not only too busy with feedings, but they were also too busy to even bother to give him a name. His official birth certificate has just a blank where the first name should be. Probably the doctor got tired waiting for them to make up their minds. Jim's business prospered. He had an office upstairs over the bank on the northeast corner of the square and had survey crews working all over northern Arizona. He traveled around a good deal, looking after the work, and left a few signatures on hotel registers here and there. Pamelia stayed in Prescott, raising the children and getting Jimmy started off to first grade in Lincoln School. She also spent quite a bit of time getting photographed with one or more of the children at Bucky O'Neill's statue. She entertained assorted relatives from Texas, including Francis Edward Griffith, a cousin about Jimmy's age who stayed one whole summer. Arizona was still a territory, and to people back east, it was still a land of Apache Indians and shoot-'em-up cowboys. Perhaps they were right. The Episcopal Church kept sending missionaries to Arizona regularly to convert the Indians and the natives to religion, while the saloon keepers just as regularly sold them firewater to keep them free. At any rate, when the territory got close enough to civilization to want to have the same taxes that civilized places had, the territorial legislature created the position of territorial engineer, charged with laying out the roads throughout the territory, and the governor appointed Jim to the job. The capital and all the state offices were in Phoenix, so Jim and Pamelia sold their home in Prescott, packed up their brood, and took the train for Phoenix in March 1909. Phoenix was a bustling western community of 9,000 people when Jim and Pamelia arrived. It had an Opry House, board sidewalks, East Lake Park where you could go for a canoe ride, a 3-story hotel, a row of Chinese joss houses down on South 2 Street, a volunteer fire brigade, and 17 saloons in adobe buildings on Washington Street. Jim hung up his hat in the state capitol building and proceeded to lay out a system of state highways, which in reality turned out to be more crayon marks on a map than passable roads on the ground. It was just too far between towns that were too small to support a road system. The only real hazard was the quicksand in crossing the few rivers, where a team of horses and a wagon might have to wait for days for the river to subside from its flood stages to allow the ferries to run. So Jim's first job as territorial engineer was to build some bridges. With not enough money and not enough men, and a merciless summer sun beating down on a sandy desert that stretched for miles and miles and miles and miles. By today's standards, they don't look like much, but they are still there, more than half a century later. The delicate tracery of ironwork in the Camp Verde Bridge, the symmetry of the arches in the Tempe Bridge. Few people pass over these bridges now. The traffic now all goes over the super highways and the super bridges higher up. But the country folk and the itinerant peddler still use them, and never look at the nameplates, or if they do, never give the name a second thought. Well, after all, half a century is a long time ago. 3 years of this was enough for Jim. So when Arizona attained statehood in 1912, Jim went downtown and hung out a shingle in the old Fleming building across the street from the Adams Hotel. It was around this time when he wrote the first milk ordinance for the city of Phoenix. Both Jimmy and Sonny were down with typhoid fever, and in tracing the disease to its source, Jim found out that the local dairy had been washing the milk bottles in the irrigation ditch. The Mexican who ran the dairy was some put out when Jim told him, backed up with a shotgun, that the bottles had to be sterilized with boiling water. Jim also got mixed up with Dr. Soshoki of the Radium Corporation. Before the atomic bomb was invented, radium was used on the numbers of clocks and watches so that they could be read in the dark. Funny thing, radioactivity and fallout and U-238 and all that thermonuclear Mickey Mouse wasn't known then. But the women who were painting these watch dials with radioactive paint were dying from what was then considered a very mysterious disease. Jim was in on the mining end of the process, at a uranium mine up in Colorado on Mount Wilson. He brought home some of the mineral, and Jimmy and Sonny had a time. They put it on photographic film and made x-rays and generally fogged up all the pictures for blocks around without any apparent harm to themselves. The Lord does protect fools and children. Jimmy, later on, got up to the mine and did some surveying and posed for another picture. Jimmy turned out to be quite a boy. He did high school in 3 years and was valedictorian of his class to boot. For Lagniappe, he did a human fly stunt of climbing up the front of the auditorium stimulate sales of the high school annual, but which stimulated the principal of the school and the chief of police and the fire department a lot more. In 1919, he attained the eminence of being a brother rat at the Virginia Military Institute. In the following 4 years, he wore stars on his sleeves every year, got thrown out of school at least once for masterminding a riot, instigated an intramural rotten egg fight, played polo on the squad that went to New Haven and got licked by Yale, and graduated at the top of his class. Meanwhile, Jim was making hay. He went back to the Grand Canyon and surveyed some dams in the bottom of the canyon to make electric power, and got the copper mines and the railroads interested enough to pay him $100,000 in one check for his water rights in the canyon. The dams in the Grand Canyon never got built, for the same reason that his scenic railroad to the bottom of the canyon never got built. There were still bureaucrats in Washington with nothing to do except think up reasons why something shouldn't be done. This time, the bureaucrats wanted to build it themselves. Creeping socialism as a name hadn't been invented yet, but Jim was beginning to get the idea. He built a dam across the Gila River to irrigate 20,000 acres of desert land. He built a dam north of Phoenix to stop the floods that had put 4 feet of water into the ground floor of the state capitol building. He built a dam near Prescott for some farmers and one over by Safford for a water company. And to top the gaudy era of the Roaring Twenties off, he hired out at a salary of $35,000 a year to a foreign government as an expert on dams and irrigation projects, and spent a couple of years riding ocean-going boats and weird-looking trains and ox carts, with Pamelia either at his side or traipsing around Europe while he was off in the sticks. He enjoyed this life, he really did. "These are the golden days," he said to himself. "Let me enjoy and always remember them." In the middle 20s, Sonny got out of high school, mostly by virtue of luck and overcrowded classes that had to be graduated to make room for next year's crop. He had excelled in a number of fields, none of them academic. He could play a banjo and do a soft shoe routine that would have been a credit to Honey Boy Evans. He had won some prizes in speech making, that gift of conversation that runs in the Girand blood. And so Jim and Pamelia thought he would make a good lawyer. The University of Virginia was reputed to have a good law school, so Sonny was shipped east to Virginia. He lost his hat and suitcase on the train and got off at Charlottesville carrying only his saxophone and a burning desire to attain eminence in any field, just so long as it wasn't academic. He landed a berth on the Virginia Reel, the school's alleged humor magazine, by virtue of coining some jokes of the "Who was that lady I seen you with?" variety. He wrote an acceptable brand of undergraduate poetic garbage that got read at those soirees where everybody sits on the floor and smokes Turkish cigarettes and talks way out yonder. He roomed with a man who owned a Stutz Bearcat, bummed around with another who drove a Pierce Arrow, and helped one of the DuPont boys pick out a Packard that would match his coonskin coat and hip flask. One Saturday night out at Fry Springs, when Dixie Dean's Dixieland Jazz Band was holding forth, Sonny thought he would sit in as a sideman for a chorus or two. The B-flat tenor saxophone was new to him. He had trained on an E-flat alto, but the fingering was the same, and it was pretty late in the evening anyhow. After 3 choruses, Dixie offered him a job. And that was the end of the beginning of a brilliant law career. It wasn't long after that the Dean of Students wrote a letter of regret, and Jim and Pamelia wired him to come home. The next few years were pretty variegated for Sonny. Sometimes he worked here and sometimes he worked there, but mostly he didn't work at all. He went to places with names like Ancud and Balboa and Chiloé. And he went to other places named Valparaiso and Guadalajara and Xochimilco. It was on the island of Chiloé, incidentally, that he composed that Ode to a South American Urn that is still quoted the entire length of the Pacific littoral, wherever men only gather. Jim and Pamelia and Jimmy and Sonny didn't know it, but an era was drawing to a close. The stock market crash of 1929 marked the beginning of the end. By the middle 30s, it was all gone. No one wanted to hire Jim for $35,000 a year, or for $35 a year for that matter. Bank failures had taken the savings, and foreclosures had taken the property acquired during a lifetime. Then, when Pamelia died, there was no incentive for Jim to go on. He stayed around a few years longer, and he tried a few things, but his heart wasn't really in it. The newspaper ran his obituary on the front page under a banner headline, and the Episcopal Church was full of flowers and people. But the one person who really counted wasn't there. Pamelia. Pamelia was down in Texas in the family cemetery plot, and her relatives didn't want or didn't have room for Jim alongside. So his friends carried him out west of Phoenix and fixed up a place for him there, which was probably all right, because Arizona was his real home. The Depression caught Jimmy at the wrong time. He was just getting started in some kind of an executive job and had been dabbling in the stock market and had acquired a wife. His wife was from Terrell, Texas, the same town where Jim met Pamelia, and she was another one of those southern gals. Her name was Anna Fields. She had some assorted relatives, including a couple of brothers, one of whom was named Oscar. Oscar and Sonny went across the line at El Paso once into Juarez, Mexico, where Oscar told the bartender that he was the only member of the Fields family that could drink gasoline and really enjoy it. But the bartender didn't have any gasoline handy, so Oscar never had a chance to prove his point. Anna's other brother, Owen, ended up down in Florida somewhere. Now, nobody had much fun during the Depression of the 1930s, and Jimmy and Anna were no exception. Jobs were not growing on trees, and there were no high-pressure recruiters hanging around offering engineers jobs at exorbitant salaries. Almost any kind of a job was a windfall, and if you were lucky enough, you could just barely have a place to hang your hat and call home by the time your firstborn was scheduled to arrive. For Jimmy and Anna, the date was December 13th, 1933, and they named her Anne. She was a cute little tyke, in her booties and bathrobe, standing in front of the Christmas tree when she was 2 years old, and as the years went by, she added dignity to her maturity. The second child, 4 years later, was a boy, and they named him James Fields Girand. But that soon enough was shortened into Jim. Easy enough to keep them separated. The old man was Jimmy, and the boy was Jim. The whole kit and caboodle moved to New York in the late 40s, where Jimmy had some kind of an executive job down on Wall Street. And when Ann and Jim finished high school, they got shipped down south to college at Duke University, the same place that used to be called Trinity College until Pamelia's impecunious tobacco farmer invented Duke's Mixture and Bull Durham and paid them $40 million to change their name to Duke University. It was at Duke that Anne met Paul Baker, Jr., who was studying business administration there, and it was in the Duke University chapel that she married him in May of 1956. Paul had some time to serve in the Air Force, and the young married couple moved around during the first few years, and just happened to be in Tampa, Florida, when their son Jeffrey was born in March of 1958. But after a while things steadied down, and they settled in Atlanta, Georgia, safe, sound, and secure. Jim was studying electrical engineering at Duke. He met Juanita Jones, who was taking geology. Just what the attraction is between electricity and geology is not quite clear at the moment, but Jim and Nita got it all straightened out by June of 1960. Her folks were living down in the tropics, in the Panama Canal Zone, so the wedding was held down there. Jimmy and Anna flew down for the wedding and for the reception afterwards, a first-class blowout, with the knights in armor and the ladies in full panoply, and the champagne flowing like water. Late in the evening, Jimmy strolled out of doors for a few minutes and looked up at the tropical moon shining through the palm trees and thought about his daughter, happily married in Atlanta, and now his son, married in a blaze of glory in Panama, and with perhaps a little encouragement from that extra glass of champagne, said to himself, "These are the golden days. Let me enjoy and always remember them." You will remember that we left Sonny in this story back when the Depression was just starting. The Depression didn't make very much difference in Sonny's life. He had spent most of his time during the boom days out of a job and unemployed. So being out of a job and unemployed during the Depression wasn't anything new. He got around over the country as usual, but didn't seem to accomplish very much. He tried another trick working gold mines in South America, and after spending a year or so down under the Southern Cross, arrived back in the United States on a tramp freighter, doing the dishes to get off of the boat. Oregon survived a few months of his efforts, and a trip down the coast of California didn't make him rich. He went back to Arizona and got a job on a survey party up in the Mormon country for a few months, and then landed back in Phoenix. For a while he made a few dollars writing news articles for trade magazines, and for 3 months wrote a column for the Phoenix Gazette, but there was more glory than money in it, so it turned out that he was practically broke when he asked Ruth Edelman to have lunch with him at the Coconut Grove in Phoenix. Now, the Coconut Grove in Phoenix, Arizona is a long, long way from the Coconut Grove in the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. The Los Angeles Grove is filled with movie stars and glamour and real palm trees. The tab for a luncheon for two with cocktails and the works can run a man as much as $40. The Phoenix Coconut Grove had fake palm trees painted on the walls, and the nearest thing to a movie star was one of the B-gals who used to work the Hollywood Strip. A beer and a burger would set you back 65 cents. It doesn't sound like much of a place for a romance to start, and it wasn't. But when the right one comes along, it makes no difference to a man where he is when he meets her. Ruth was always photogenic. Starting at the age of 1, she stretched out on a velour covering in A.D. Burke's Photographic Saloon in Cleveland, Ohio, and had herself recorded for posterity au naturel. Her family moved to Phoenix when she was 3 years old, 1913. In grammar school days she bothered her mother a good deal, puttering around the kitchen, rattling pots and pans, and spilling flour on the floor, and dirtying up dishes, and occasionally turning out a pretty tasty batch of cookies. By high school time she had settled down into a reading and play acting groove, with the usual amount of running around that is done among boys and girls in a small town. After high school, while she was in college, she did a bit of semi-pro dramatic work with the local little theater, back in the days when it was all work and no play, and very little glory for the participants. She liked horses and outdoor scenery, and never did get around to being one of Scott Fitzgerald's lost generation. The Depression put an end to most of the schoolgirl dreams, and so she got a job. All in all, she was quite a gal, and it is no wonder that Sonny did a double take. They made a pair. Lots of time and no money. When they went up to the county clerk in 1937 to get a marriage license, Sonny had $6, and the license cost $3. When they got married, it wasn't a high church affair with everybody in morning coats and $700 worth of flowers tastefully arranged. There were no well-heeled relatives for them to dog out a wedding reception and load the bride with loot from Tiffany's. Sonny had a diamond that Pamelia had given him, which did double duty as an engagement ring and a wedding ring. They went to Tucson for a honeymoon, and later on borrowed a spare room from some of Ruth's relatives for a home. The home was out in the desert where snakes and centipedes and scorpions abounded, And one night when they were first married, Sonny threw Ruth out of bed just in time to keep a scorpion from getting her. She thought he was crazy until she saw the scorpion. Sometimes she still thinks he's crazy. It just took a little time. A year or so later, when Butch was born, his real name is John, spelled Jon, without the H. They had to haul him around in a laundry basket. But 4 years later, when Mike was born, Sonny and Ruth had a home of their own, and Sonny was started off on his business career. Butch and Mike and Ruth and Sonny stayed home. No chicken a la king luncheon clubs for Sonny, and no gibble, gabble, and gossip at the bridge club for Ruth. This is the way to live. Home is a castle. Here is where dreams come true. Butch and Mike grew up together. They played together, quarreled together, shared the same room together, and even had their picture taken, standing together at the base of the statue of Bucky O'Neill in Prescott. It is a wonderful thing to see two brothers who live and believe in a family heritage. Butch is the quiet one. A person never really knows what he is thinking about, away down deep inside. He made above average grades in high school, but it was all done sort of noiselessly. Grades. After high school, he went to college in Colorado, and without any fanfare or publicity, built up quietly, made Lancers the school tradition club, won a first at bridge in intercollegiate competition, got elected president of the Phi Delta Theta fraternity, and became the first to negotiate the 5-year engineering school. Mike, 4 years younger, really hit the high spots in his high school career. A 6-foot, 160-pound bundle of supercharged energy, he was truly the man who had everything. A letterman on the football team, an invited member of the class of advanced math students, winner of prizes, trips, and money in electronics, the darling of his teachers who just couldn't do enough for him. But don't get any idea it was given to him, because it wasn't. He earned every bit of it. He had 3 years of grueling and anonymous punishment as a rinky-dink on the football squad before he ever got into a game. While other grasshoppers were fiddling away a summer, he was in math school earning the invitation to that advanced math class. He spent hours and days and weeks and months doing and redoing, finishing and super finishing the radio experiment that won him the prize in San Francisco. And as for teachers, he helped them, grading papers for them, tutoring and cajoling reluctant students, and always a living demonstration that teaching can be a rewarding profession. Ruth and Sonny were doing better now. At last he had found his place in the world, heading up a small team of engineers who were freelancing and making a success of it. Ruth and Sonny had a home out near Camelback Mountain in Arcadia, and a life that was smooth and emotionally secure. One day not long ago, Ruth and Sonny were walking down a street in San Francisco. Now, San Francisco was the town that had an earthquake the year Sonny was born. And here he was, some 50 years later, walking down the street in San Francisco, saying to himself, "These are the golden days. Let me enjoy and always remember them." This script was narrated by John Girand in October 1960.